chciałbym wszystkich bardzo serdecznie powitać, przede wszystkim naszych gości z Gruzji i z...
I would like to extend special welcome to our guests from Georgia and Germany, our panelists, and the participants from Poland. I would like to welcome all those who will be observing our video conference. Towards the end, there will be an opportunity to ask questions. I would also like to thank our sponsor, the Polish National Foundation, which made it possible for us to organize this webinar conference. And also I would like to thank Professor Beriashvili, who has for some time now been promoting, talking about the idea of talking within such a group, in such a format, Polish, Georgian, and German, extending collaboration between philosophers. I know from my own personal experience that the collaboration between Georgia and Germany is very intense. I had the opportunity to participate in several conferences already. Today, I would like us to proceed in the format of this tripartite discussion: 3 countries, 3 nations, 3 groups of philosophers. I hope that this first meeting will be the beginning of our collaboration. It will be devoted to a more practical topic, but of course, all the theoretical reflections on the philosophical heritage will be welcome. Today, we would like to talk about Europe during the pandemic, about the social, economic, and political consequences have been brought by the pandemic. We have divided our conference into 3 parts. I will be leading the first panel. The second panel will be facilitated by Mr. Bronisław Wilczstein. The third panel will be led by Professor Andrzej Zybertowicz. And in each panel, we have a participant from Poland, Germany, and from Georgia. In the first part, which I would like to start now, I would like us to talk about human rights during the pandemic and the rights of the community. Let me first present our participants. We will be joined by Professor Georg Roman, a philosopher from the University of Magdeburg, who's been focusing on human rights. Quite recently, he published a big piece of work on this topic. He focuses on a practical philosophy. The second participant in our panel will be Professor Mamuka Beriashvili, also a philosopher, specializing in the German tradition in philosophy, Hegel and Heidegger. Recently, I had the impression that Professor Beriashvili has been using these philosophical concepts to provide more and more precise analysis of the reality that surrounds us, or that sometimes quite aggressively surrounds us. And the third participant will be Professor Ryszard Legutko, a philosopher, the member of the European Parliament. I'm also very interested in your opinion. Professor Legutko is a specialist, an expert in liberalism, and professionally he has focused on ancient philosophy. focusing on Plato and Socrates. Recently, he's published a book about Socrates philosophers. He also wrote a very influential book about liberal democracy. Today, Le Figaro published an interview with Professor Legutko. I invite you all to read it. It's a very interesting read, very interesting interview, very relevant for the ethical and cultural conflicts raging in Europe right now. All right, without further ado, let's just talk about housekeeping at the very beginning. Each participant will have 10 minutes according to our agenda, and then we'll have a short summary and additional questions to the panelists. Then the panelists will have each 5 minutes to express their opinions. The first round, 10 minutes per panelist. My question to all the panelists is the following. As we know, Europe, there are restrictions as to the way in which we can move and things we can do, and some people claim that their basic civil rights and human rights are being infringed. Some people even say, and it's quite widespread, that we are dealing with a sanitary regime dictatorship, limiting the individual freedoms, that during the pandemic there are interests being enforced which are not entirely clear. There is confusion. We do understand that all the restrictions are imposed because of the community rights. And this issue seems to be also relevant for the immigration crisis, where the same argument has been raised there. Some people said that we need to protect our communities. Our cultural communities do have some rights that need to be protected, and that sometimes are contradictory to individual human rights. So I would like to ask you about this dilemma and ask you, what is your opinion on this issue? Do you also see that there is such a conflict or such a tension between community rights and individual human rights? And what is happening to human rights in this difficult time? Let's start with Professor Roman, then Professor Beriashvili, and then Professor Legutko. 10 minutes each, please. Sir? Thank you very much. Can you hear me? All right. All right, I'll say very briefly something that I prepared as a presentation. Our facilitator said that the actions undertaken in order to restrict the pandemics are also restricting human rights. Some people say go even further and say that these restrictions have been cancelling the individual human rights altogether. So the question is, what kind of individual human rights are being infringed here? Basically, it's the freedom of movement, and the freedom to exercise your profession, and to go on with your daily life, go to a restaurant, use other attractions. There are also other restrictions that are being imposed gradually. For example, the freedom of association in groups. There are some authoritarian measures and authoritarian decisions to move, for example, the date of general elections because of the pandemics. So we have to be very careful. On the other hand, we have to say that human rights need to protect human health. In both human rights documents, the right to remain healthy is not included. However, the the Universal Declaration of Rights does include such a clause, and countries have been undertaking measures in order to protect physical and mental health of their citizens, and they also applied measures to prevent spread of diseases and infectious diseases, and such measures also necessitate actions that necessitate the health professional interventions ensured by the state. All the European member states ratified this document also, and are so bound to do anything they can also during this coronavirus pandemic to ensure public health. And this is a critical point by which we can check whether human rights can be restricted or not. Let me just add that human rights and all other rights may be limited by enforcing other rights. The freedom of movement, of course, needs to be limited. You cannot enter the road because the drivers drive there, but the drivers' freedoms are also limited by speed limits, for example. This is very normal. However, the restriction of human rights and these rights need to be proportional. So the question is whether human rights are being now restricted in a proportionate way, and this is really the key question for this discussion in the context of fighting the pandemics and protecting public health. Whether these criteria that have been applied are correct or not, it's also a question. We may expect that the parliaments and the courts are going to discuss that. What criteria can be used to limit the rights? We see that many regions, many public authorities, seeing the need to act, do not ask the parliaments or courts, but just enforce such restrictions. For example, in Germany, during the lockdown, people were forbidden from leaving their apartments. You could not go to restaurants, the theaters and cinemas were closed. The question is whether this was proportionate and suitable. The citizens were lodging their complaints, and the courts were actually checking. How they were checking? They pondered whether the decision taken by the authorities was to ensure the health of the citizens and whether this decision could potentially save patients. If the answer was yes, then the next question was whether this was really a restriction of human rights. Of course, this topic is very much open question, open issue. We need to say that many member states, EU member states, should do anything they can in order to facilitate the public discussion on the possibilities to restrict human rights. Of course, the governments or individual ministries cannot decide on their own whether they can limit human rights. We need public discussion on this. We can check each and every situation, but the court decisions come after. Why is it so difficult to make such decisions. After such decisions are made, the pandemics need to decrease. We cannot have these decisions to lead to a situation when we have an increase in the infection cases. If the infection numbers decrease, we still cannot say if the decision was a success, because sometimes these were just prevention measures. It's very difficult to judge whether these decisions were correct, and to see if the situation was really put under control because of this decision. So we need public debate on this. And the last topic I would like to discuss in this context is that you know that in the countries where we have dictatorships, such as China, the authorities took a series of steps in order to contain the pandemics, and they were quite successful, if we are to believe the official records. And these countries, even these countries, say that democracies need to discuss. But the democracies who need to discuss, they do not take successful and effective measures. That's why the dictatorships seem to be more effective right now than the democracies where we need to have public debate on everything. The authorities such as China say that they are actually more able to deal with the modern challenges. That's why they're promoting their own political systems as a better alternative to democracies. That's why Europe is very vigilant and really watch very carefully how democratic countries want to deal with the situation. What can we accept? What risk can we accept? Our goal is to achieve both protection of human rights and protect the public health. Thank you very much.
Przepraszam, bo nie udało mi się włączyć mikrofonu. W każdym razie dziękuję bardzo za ciekawe wystąpienie. I teraz profesor Beriaszwili jako następny w tej sprawie.
Mr. Professor Beriaszwili, second to take the floor. Your mic is off, Professor.
U góry trzeba... O, teraz jest włączony. Tak, proszę bardzo.
Now it's on. Right, there you go.
Panie profesorze, proszę.
Professor?
Tak, proszę bardzo.
Also, ich muss Herr Professor Lohmann zustimmen, was er in seinem so kleinen skizzierten Beitrag geschrieben hat, dass die Menschenrechte schützen mehr als bloße Überleben des individuellen Menschen. In der Tat, Menschenrechte ist ein weltgemeinschaftliches Gut, also eine Errungenschaft der demokratischen Welt. Aber geht es jetzt während der Pandemie Covid-19 um das bloße Überleben des einzelnen Menschen, Personen, Staaten, sogar Völker oder Verletzung oder Sicherung der Menschenrechte?
So during the pandemic, it's not about the illness as such, the disease as such. It's about human rights. So survival issues are there in every country, in many countries on a daily basis. Children die because they have no access to potable water. That's thousands of children per year. But also democratic communities have the issues of epidemics, for example. This epidemic has changed the whole world. We've all been influenced by this disease. The pandemic has brought to light a series of issues. Things change due to the pandemic. What are the results of the pandemic and its impact on the life of the average person? what's the impact of the pandemic on politics, culture, the economy. Many among these issues are now knowns. So the pandemic impacts the relations among countries, individuals. What is the situation in democratic countries? Well, particularly interesting as a question is whether big democratic countries limit the rights of smaller countries, smaller states. Are we dealing with a limitation, a restriction of freedom? Is that so? Well, the pandemic is a challenge for every single one of us. The limitations of freedoms in democratic states also have a moral dimension, ethical dimension. The personal freedom has to be limited with the freedom of another person, so it ends where the liberty of another individual starts. Probably, occasionally, in cases such as the pandemic, liberties have to be limited. It is important for everybody to have the same kind of liberties and freedoms. I want to have the right to live free of threats. But if the freedom of the individual has to be so much restricted to an extent where it cannot be executed anymore, then that's a difficult situation, and a decision has to be made about the moral rules to be applied in such situations. And from experience, we know that there are two possibilities. One is utilitarian argumentation that can be applied along the following lines. If the society makes moral decisions, then it has to make a certain choice. During a pandemic, the issues are not only human rights, but also a social dimension. Namely, how do we relate to one another? How do we behave towards others? And how should the state treat the individual? What individual freedoms should be executed? How should the global society develop? So that it be able to deal with these issues and be prepared for them. The COVID-19 pandemic has a number of dimensions, both positive and negative ones. They deal with globalization. New solutions are being introduced, and they are portrayed as necessary. The global society, particularly in the beginning of the pandemic, had to make a choice about whether to make a choice to survive. We are either global countries, global states, or nation states. The EU countries have been collaborating, and also on a global scale, the decision was made to collaborate jointly. I am of the opinion that solidarity, as a rule, is not enough. One could refer to Hegel, and I think Professor Lohmann will be happy to hear this. If there is no relation to the other, then we are not a real human being. The legitimacy of one state is confirmed by the cooperation with other states. Therefore, the state should not intervene in the issues of the other state But on the other hand, it has to accept the independence of the other. And this is the guarantee for the second one to accept the existence and the rights of the first state. Therefore, it is of importance what happens in the second state. So one has to say that the decision being made in terms of solidarity and action is along the lines of the freedoms of a democratic state. I think I still have some time to go, so I can continue. So the activities, the actions of a state have to they require the acceptance, and this is a condition for democracy. From the point of view of politics, the state every state is obliged to cooperate and accept the independence of the other countries along the model of democracy implemented by the EU. We've seen that it's been ever more stressed how important it is to cooperate and cooperate in solidarity, which does not mean that nation states have no power and no remit and no rights, and that they hand the rights over. No, it means there's a certain form of power of governance in a group of states, which means that no single country has rights over a single other nation along the Greek definition of democracy. So tradition is of high importance. Nowadays, it is key not to approach one another from the point of view of hegemony, but with an openness to the other's culture and with an open understanding. Globalization gives us the opportunity to implement the rule of freedom worldwide, while nation states are forced by other big states, countries, hegemons, which tends to happen in various contexts. There's the risk for nationalism and separatism. While it is very important to create a peaceful coexistence. So what are the conditions for our coexistence and globalization in a peaceful context? This is a question we are going to look for an answer to. Now, Professor Legutko, 10 minutes. You have 10 minutes. Dear Professor, so how are things with human rights during the pandemic? Hello, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear Professor. I am very sorry, but I have nothing to say. I must admit that I do not fully understand the whole issue, so I don't know what to tell you. And yet, having been encouraged by you to refer to a wider context, let me now devote 10 minutes to telling you what I think about the whole concept of human rights. And I have a negative view. We all know that human rights are a modern religion. It's a religion that has taken over the right, the law, morality, and it's a false religion. I know it sounds blasphemous, but there's nothing I can do about it. I don't really understand the what sense it makes to introduce such a word. What does it mean? If we want to have a freedom of speech, then we need to formulate a law, a legal rule that would guarantee such a freedom of speech. So introduce a lex. It should be formulated. Such a law, a lex, would be a normal part of the system, because the right to free speech is a strange formulation. I don't know where it stems from, and this is something I don't want to delve into. I wrote a bit about this in one of my books. Let me instead refer to a very well-known sentence from Saint Matthew's and Saint Luke's. You will recognize them by their fruit. What is the fruit of the religion of human rights? Do we have more freedom today? Do we have more than we had 30 or 40 years ago? And I'm talking about the Western societies rather than those that emerged from the communist bloc. There's no time to delve into that. The answer is very simple. There is less freedom, and the human rights do not generate freedom. They might even limit freedom. Why? Well, human rights have no foundation. They are arbitrary. Their number is unknown. Their hierarchy is fully arbitrary, and their interpretation is as well. Since the list is limitless and it's endless, so it's a kind of financial pyramid, and putting them together is not usually based in arguments and logic. It's rather arbitrary. It's a kind of imposition of a certain point of view from a position of power. So they are contrary to their original goal, because the goal in the beginning was protecting the individual from power. Let's take freedom of speech. Why is there less freedom of speech? Well, because there's the hate speech, so-called. So we have freedom of speech, but this speech cannot be based in hatred. And what might that hatred be? Well, it might be based in different freedoms for respect, equal treatment, etc. So again, this is a difficult territory because, for example, blasphemy against the ideas against the Christian religion is not protected, while the Muslim religion is protected with freedom from hate speech. So again, the conclusion here is that the bottom line is not freedom, it's not respect, it's fear. There is a whole group of professors, philosophers, and lawyers who are afraid to take different positions. Let's take the right to live. That's a basic one, but also there's the women's rights, where they are not based in any international convention or the European Basic Rights Charter or any other. While euthanasia is there, abortion is there. These are issues that are protected by the rights of women, while they are against the right to live. While the women's rights are just a creation of feminist conventions, conferences, etc. So they do not exist in international law, but try and speak up about that in an international group. The subsidiarity is a rule that is inexistent practically in the EU anymore. There's the constitution rule. There's a number of others that are contradicted by those speaking about gender rights, etc. So it's all focused to a certain position, a certain kind of conclusions. Human rights, in particular, are founded in the Human Rights Convention. If you take the Article 9 of the European Basic Rights Charter, you will see that the right to start a family, etc., should be protected by law. And you will see that the Polish legal system protects those freedoms. Is it respected? No, it is not being respected, because when a number of communities, municipalities adopted such declarations along those lines, it was announced in contradiction to European values, while Article 9 is being absolutely looked over. It's absolutely impotent. So the notion of human rights shifts focus away from rules, values, and this generates a position in which the human rights are treated as a religion, where we are in the position of fighting for a new, better, brave world. Human rights activists, that's a proud notion, while such a position promotes very aggressive, egocentric values. Have you heard about what happens, what happened recently in Poland and the pro-abortion movement? Well, it's a certain fanatism combined with barbarian approaches, attitudes, which was really terrible in its results. There's this conflict of rights. There's a pyramid in which the one who's a bigger fanatic wins. I think my 10 minutes are over. Thank you. Let me hand over. Thank you very much.
It is even more interesting now in this difficult situation. We do have a discussion going on between the panelists as well. But I did find common element, and that's why I'm going to ask you a second question. Regardless of the source of human rights, let's just assume that we have lex, that Professor Legutko mentioned that there is a community, a political community that always sets itself some goals. I'm not sure whether all our panelists would agree. We do have situations, as Professor said, that in which the rights need to be restricted, but he also said that during the pandemic, we have to deal with a lot of restrictions in terms of restricting freedom of movement, freedom to leave your flat, the need to postpone elections, which was also an issue here in Poland. The problem is that in our society, we frequently face a question about the appropriateness of these restrictions. Professor, you mentioned angemessen, and you said that the court might actually decide on this. But the question is, why should the courts decide? From many different points of view, many different things might be appropriate from the point of view of businesses and hotel owners. The restrictions imposed and appropriate from the point of view of other social groups are completely inappropriate. We also have to deal with the conflict between generations. Young people think that a lot of restrictions are inappropriate and they are actually serving the interests of other groups. That's why we're facing a question about arbitrary choice. That's why Professor Legutko probably mentioned this. Taking different positions on the issue of human rights, he said that it might be an arbitrary choice to, let's say, discuss the rights of child and the rights of women. While we are talking about rights that are actually bestowed on us by the community, not natural rights. And then we are facing a political solution. If we do have different groups, we need to achieve some equilibrium and appropriateness. We might consider whether we should open this kind of business for operation, whether we should allow students to go back to schools, who should be vaccinated first. So in a way, we can say that what Professor Legutko mentioned towards the end of his intervention, we have an ongoing debate around the rights of different groups, and it's a political debate and a political battle. Wolfgang Thiersen was the latest victim of such a battle when he voiced his critique, saying that different groups are demanding their rights to be respected. Professor Lohmann mentioned the conflict around the necessity to protect one's national group. At the beginning of the pandemics, the countries were closing the borders, considering it necessary to protect the citizens. The same goes on in the Czech Republic right now, in the border between France and Germany, for political reasons and for historical reasons. These restrictions at that border are much less strict than those between Germany and Czech Republic. So the question remains whether perhaps we are dealing with decisions that are being the result of collective political processes, and thus we cannot refer to the courts to different understandings of the rights and the appropriateness of restrictions. We do not seem to have any universal common solution that would spring from some general rules. So the question to Professor Lohmann is, what would be the basis for courts' decisions? The courts also need to consider interests of different groups, businesses, etc., etc. So, also a question to Professor Legutko. Perhaps you could see some common ground in your interventions, regardless of what the source of human rights is. And perhaps the solution might be what Professor Beriashvili suggested, a kind of remoralizing the world. Perhaps, however, this is also another utopia that goes far beyond what our collaboration within EU is based on. So perhaps I'll ask first Professor Lohmann to respond. 5 minutes each. Thank you very much. Well, I think now we're talking about a Polish reality. And it's very interesting. But perhaps I should mention two things. First of all, what do we understand by human rights? My premise was that human rights, as I said, can be restricted by other rights introduced appropriately, and the pandemics has confronted us with quite a stressful situation where ordinary ways of acting, ordinary decisions that were quite okay in the past are no longer appropriate or are being challenged. Once again, human rights is not a religion. They are legal answers to the lack of justice faced by human beings over a long period of time, and they are the rights who were established following World War II as a response and a reaction to the crimes of Second World War, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or the Charter of Fundamental Rights are the documents who are within this convention valid and who bind all the member states to respect them. Whether we consider this in the context of the Lisbon Treaty or not, it's not a question whether we want it or not. The human rights are not only a moral issue; they can be justified from the moral point of view, but they are also justified from the legal point of view. That's why in democracies, in countries governed with the rule of law, all these conventions, all these documents have to be respected. That's why no country can now say that they're going to introduce and enforce emergency state and do whatever they like. If the countries decide to follow such measures, this needs to be only temporary. For example, quite recently in Hamburg, they introduced a special law, but it's only in operation. It will only be in operation for 2 months. So it's only a temporary solution and a temporary measure, introducing temporary restriction, which is not an infringement of human rights. And then we have two possibilities in terms of appropriateness. Everyone can ask what would be appropriate action and behavior from one point of view, and we need to estimate the risk of each and every decision. For example, in terms of traffic, road traffic, participation in the traffic involves the risk of, let's say, on average, 10 people a week dying. We cannot do anything that would endanger the life of another person, but nobody's actually asking themselves whether they can participate in traffic. We can participate in traffic, but we have to behave accordingly, according to the rules. It does not mean that we cannot do anything. We cannot do things that increase the risk of accidents in road traffic. Which means that we need to respect the speed limits, etc., etc. And it also applies, metaphorically, to the pandemics. All the citizens need to behave appropriately, and you are absolutely right. It is, and it involves a subjective approach. My behavior might be dangerous to others, and hence the discussion, as you said, quite rightly, that a restaurant owner can argue that the situation from their point of view looks in a different way than it looks for a person who is in the risk group and live in the old people's home. That's why in such situations it's the state which decides. Usually it's the parliament passing the laws. If it doesn't happen, then, as you rightly said, the government might apply some preventive measures, but whatever is decided then needs to be checked by the parliaments and by the courts. What happened in Germany, the Ministry of Health made some decisions. For example, that people working in a specific region cannot go farther away from their home than, let's say, 15 kilometers. And then the court later on decided that it was incorrect. And then the law, the decision was corrected. And you are right that the decision by the court always comes too late, but it does influence the legislator and the authorities who enforce the rules. The courts, so that the authorities can take decisions, but they need to take into account that that they might have to correct their decisions. And then all the rights, not only the individual rights, can be changed in this way. That's the situation right now. Professor Beriashvili, maybe you can answer. Sorry, I don't think I answered your question. All right, you can continue, but just 1 minute, please. The European community decided that we will act in the spirit of solidarity. For example, the vaccines will be bought for all the countries because there are some member states which, for financial reasons, are not able to buy enough vaccines on the free market. And there are some member states that are being egoistic and they buy the vaccines on their own because they decided that they consider that the EU has not been effective enough. Of course, we can argue about this. And such a form of solidarity has also been enforced in law, and it can be criticized and critiqued on moral grounds. And here, Hegel is important, because based on his thought, each and every country fighting the pandemics, in order to prevent any further spread of disease, all the countries and each and every of the countries, it lies in their interest to actually have solidarity in fighting the pandemics, to prevent further spread of disease. It is in our interests. Thank you very much. Professor Beriashvili, please switch on your microphone because we cannot hear you. Your microphone is switched off.
Aber ich sehe, dass nicht eingeschaltet hat. Professor Beriashvili, jetzt hat sich
Professor Beriashvili.
Okay, dann ich schlage vor, dann gehen wir zu...
Herr Krasnodębski, hören Sie mich?
Ja?
Weiß. Ich möchte mal nur was fragen. Hören Sie
Can you
mich?
hear me? Let me ask a question, but first, can you hear me? I don't hear the interpretation at all. You need to change the language, the channel. If you click on top of the page, you can choose the language in which you will have the interpretation. Language interpretation, you can pick specific language. All right, but I cannot find this, sorry. So can you please find the button in the right upper corner? If you press on the button, you will have 3 points, and then you'll have access to more functionalities. So this is the button participants, then you go to more, and then you have the tab language interpretation. And then you choose the language in which you want to listen. Unfortunately, I don't have this. Sorry, I'm terribly sorry. All right. So then we should ask questions in English, but please try once again. I think it would be difficult. Let me see what I can do. On top of the page, you should, on top of your screen. Well, let me ask my son. All right, it's a good idea. Maybe that will be. I'm sorry, I kept speaking and I didn't realize that my microphone was on. No, it was off, so no problem. All right, so let me ask my son how to deal with the situation. No worries. All right, I would like to ask Professor Beriashvili and Professor Legutko to answer. Professor Legutko, perhaps? Mr. Vice, could you please switch off your microphone? Professor Legutko, please. Well, as I said, I don't have much to say on this topic. We do live in very difficult times. We cannot compare it to anything that was in the past. This is completely new, very dangerous, the feeling of insecurity that people feel, and we need to be rational. This rationality, I think, is the principle that we should all subscribe to. I mean, those in power and those who are being ruled, governed. But I do understand that this is not always easy to do, because some actions have very strong consequences. If somebody owns a restaurant and they need to close it, of course, this is going to be to bring big consequences. But we do observe a lot of irrational behaviors. People coming together in large groups just to have fun. And people say that the government cannot prevent them from doing this because they have the right to have fun. And they do have this collective fun in Polish mountain resorts, for example. Your microphone has been switched off. Yeah, so on the beach or in the mountains, we have seen such situations. So there is quite a lot of such irrational behavior and rebellion, including human rights, courts, legislative acts based on human rights seems to be futile. I do understand that we live in times where everybody speak about human rights, but let's not fool ourselves that it's going to change anything. It's not going to change anything. Either we act rationally or irrationally. And the justification through court decisions, if the court pronounces that people cannot go into the forest, they cannot enter 50 meters into the forest, but they can actually go 20 meters into the forest. It's actually quite futile. Perhaps one of the reasons is that the culture of human rights made the modern people full of demands. If there's anything wrong, people will just protest and say that they have the right to do something. That's why sometimes it's very difficult to reach the wider public with a general message. But at times such as these, we need discipline, and that would be it from me. I don't have anything else to add about. I can speak a lot about human rights and critique them, but probably this is a topic for another meeting. Thank you.
Wrócimy, a teraz jeszcze oddam głos profesorowi Beriaszwili.
Let's go back to that topic later on. And before, let me hand over to Professor Beriaszwili.
Meiner Meinung nach eigentlich jetzt sind nicht Menschenrechte verletzt, sondern natürlich also Freiheiten des Menschen.
Well then, it is my belief that it's not human rights that are being breached. In any case, everybody should stick with this. It's obvious that human rights are being limited, restricted. They should not be limited, do not boil down to the freedom to live a healthy life. What are the restrictions introduced by individual countries? Well, it's not. I'm not in a position to say whether they are rightly so introduced or not. The ways that European states act, the rules along which they behave are right, and that's decisive. They are the right way to operate, not only in order to fight off the pandemic, but also to be resilient in the future to all kinds of issues. Problems that are not necessarily of an epidemiological character, but economic ones and other. So, since we are speaking of the EU and other democratic communities, if we are to act globally as democratic communities, then we have to base what we do in moral laws, including human rights, because they are a part of the foundation of this common denominator of morality and ethics. Then humanity in the future is supposed to have a better position to deal with that kind of issues. Well, why did I quote Hegel? Well, I did that because it's about a certain reciprocity, a symmetrical character of relationships among countries. Not only when smaller states are being forced to something during the pandemic or in the future, when they are forced to certain kinds of behavior, that should not be imposed. Also, reciprocity and solidarity should be applied as rules. And that's what I meant, and that is why I commented along those lines. That's all on my part. Well, from my point of view, this debate has been a very interesting one. There's a number of points to pick up on in the future. At one point, Professor Lohmann reacted to Professor Legutko by saying that we seem to be in a Polish reality, and then in your response, you said the following by referring to the Nazi atrocities and legal changes. You said that human rights are a legal reality, and that makes me think that we are in a German reality to a certain extent. Perhaps certain basic issues should be cleared out. This does not mean that we do not respect freedom in Poland, that we do not apply respect, personal respect. We do believe that there are inalienable rights assigned to individuals along the Catholic Christian ethics. What I mean is a certain modern individualism, or rather postmodern individualism, the reference to law is what I mean. But Professor Beriashvili mentioned the right to live a healthy life. Sure, if we are of ill health, then we will not go to court unless there was some medical mistake. Well, Professor Lohmann said this is not a religion, this is hard legal reality, referring to human rights. While the issue is the following: this social reality is a source of legal changes and even going around the law. If I understood correctly, Mr. Lohmann referred to the European Charter of Fundamental Rights. Let me remind you that our country has opted out of it, and which is not being respected, while Article 51 of the Charter says that it's only applied in the scope of the European rights, while no member of the European Parliament pays attention to that. They do not pay any attention to legal provisions, which is what Mr. Legutko mentioned. Of course, there are international conventions which are being respected, observed, and applied, including European treaties. And the reality, legal reality, are the obligations stemming from those and the rights of the individual. Again, referring to the language of rights, this is being breached by assuming that we are in breach of law, which is not the case. Let's just take the rule of subsidiarity mentioned by Professor Legutko. A last comment on the vaccines, because it was raised by Mr. Beriashvili, Professor Beriashvili. Commissioner Breton said today that there is nothing wrong in individual countries buying the vaccines from China and from Russia. So, again, at a certain point, the assumption is that this is, provided for in the individual situation. It is the right way to act. Although there was this solidary purchase, that is a certain binding agreement among states that they will purchase the vaccines together, collectively, but this was found as too centralistic and inefficient at the end of the day. So these are not two moral rules, because acting together is always better from the point of view of ethics, among others. Because it was found that it might be better, but in this situation, this leads to consequences that are unacceptable morally. That is, there is not enough of the vaccines and they cannot be provided for the citizens by their governments, and the citizens are dissatisfied, and rightly so. Let me wrap this up. There is a lot of interesting strands in this discussion, but let's move to the next panel, which will be held by Mr. Wildstein, by Bronisław Wildstein. Let me remind you that the Association of Creators of the Republic of Poland is the host of this event, which is an important social organization, independent one, associating writers, filmmakers, and such. Let me now hand over to Professor Wildstein, a Polish writer, journalist, and a defendant of human rights, I think I might say. And he was a pioneer of the Polish opposition even before Solidarność. In the 70s, the student committee was created. The Solidarity Committee, that's the name. That was the Student Solidarity Committee, and that's where the name of Solidarity, Solidarność, later came from, which is something we might have time to go back to later on another opportunity. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. It is my honor to host this panel. trying to respond to the question, what we have learned about our societies. Of course, we will not answer this question, but we might have an interesting discussion. Let me start by presenting the participants. Dr. Alexander Temkin, a social activist, philosopher, head of a social movement and a association for the Polish humanities. Ms. Ketevan Czersiewili, who is a graduate student of sociology, she works at the Georgian Technical University, and she specializes in sociology and religion, particularly the Western social perspective of Christianity on Eastern Christianity. She is working on a thesis of aspects of unexpected situations on the Orthodox Church. And the third participant is Professor Johannes Weiss, professor of social theory, sociology of culture. He earned his PhD in Würzburg. He founded the Institute of Culture Studies and the Leipzig University. He worked at. He won a scholarship of Max Weber Foundation. Much more could be said about our panelists, but unfortunately, I have to spare my words. Let me hand over to them in a minute, but let me start by a very trivial sentence along the lines that the situation such as the current one is a kind of magnifying glass. That is, they allow us to look at behaviors, people, and social machinery, and all kinds of manifestations in literature and writing. And this is something we are currently being part of. That is, there are these attempts at looking at the current situation. One of such was the Peloponnese War, which talked about the disease that decimated Athens, and other such examples can be found in literature. Working as a magnifying glass on such situations, diseases, epidemics. This is, at the end of the day, quite obvious. That is, people either behave like animals, like beasts, that they need social bonds, and that these are transformed in the process. On every opportunity, this kind of phenomena, such as the current pandemic, tell us something about the current state of affairs, and this is something we would like to focus today, but that's up to you. The first to go, Dr. Temkin. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. It is an honor and a big pleasure, particularly since my grandfather was Georgian. So every opportunity to touch upon the Georgian culture is a tremendous experience to me personally. This presentation is going to be shorter than 10 minutes, I hope so at least, which will allow for more leeway in the discussion further on. Let me begin. In the name of God. The governor of Texas said he was ready to die for the good of the American economy, and he believed that many elderly people believed the same. On the 28th of March, Pope Francis warned against a possibility of viral massacre, which will transform into the reality. There's the state of pandemic in Poland later on, and since March, there are attacks. There have been attacks from the proponents of the opening of the economy. and Poland. The first sentences of an article by Grzegorz Hajderowicz saying that the medicine seems to be worse than the disease, I think, were written on the day of the announcement of the pandemic, the state of pandemic. On the 25th of March, in an article for Polska The Times, I wrote that it was a key question. We had to answer who we want to be on the other side of the pandemic, and that there's a need for a bailout, for lockdown to be possible. On the 30th of March, I published an article in Gazeta Wyborcza talking about generals who call for means against the economy and leaving people without means to live as a result of the pandemic. Then we launched the initiative which I had. The main postulate was launching an European fund which will finance 3-month-long direct support in the form of a 500 plus for inhabitants, citizens of the countries under COVID. The initiative was supported by the closest collaborators of the Pope, the Conference of European Rabbis, the most important organization of rabbis in Europe, had chief economists in Poland, in Europe. Let me not quote all of them, Philip Zimbardo, Rowan Williams, Archbishop Karl Ginsburg, Manfred Weber, Axel Honneth, Tomasz Terlikowski, Andrzej Nowak, to green members of parliament from France and Germany. There are too many to enumerate at this point. The initiative was published in New York Times, Washington Post, and in many European newspapers. And in the recent years, no such wide initiative was formed before. Europe decided to go for a common debt, and it did not decide to go for direct transfers supporting financially the citizens of the European countries. The consequences are visible on a daily basis, and citizens feel that the social contract has been broken. There's an anti-pandemic public morality concerning the public sphere, and sometimes even the private one, which is a breach of liberal procedures. With a bow to our German participants. Well, countries call this the new normal, and they give nothing in return. Cash, that is direct transfers, which have been talked about by us, are a symbol of a certain relationship, a relationship of reciprocity between the citizen and the political organization. Political elites have been imposing their claims, so they should be giving something in return. They should make a move, a gesture, should give up part of their economic power. The feeling of a social contract being breached, that the political order has been delegitimized, is commonplace. The risk is that the political scene will be taken over by the proponents of a pro-Russian option. If we are not to give up the bases of our civilization to barbarian libertarianism and postmodern Geronto wonder, we have to respond to this feeling of delegitimization of order by organizing the direct transfers along the example of the American transfers applied by Donald Trump and recently by President Biden. Well, I talked about the feeling of delegitimization and this social disaster that we are facing, and I shifted, along the requirements of this meeting, and will be happy to refer to purely epidemiological issues if need be later on in the discussion, if you wish.
Dziękuję panu doktorowi, zwłaszcza.
Thank you very much. Thank you for keeping the time discipline. Now I would like to ask Ms. Ketevan-Reuschwili to take the floor.
Proszę bardzo.
Hello, can you hear me? I understand that I can start. All right. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to present here at this conference, at the seminar. The pandemic has affected all the areas of our life, also our communities, our economic life, legal life, social life, healthcare and healthcare system. Everywhere, the impact of the crisis is acutely felt. That's why I would like, during our seminar, to talk about the concept that has been used very frequently in the context of the pandemics. For a better understanding, I'm talking about contingency. I think I should mention Niklas Luhmann as one of the major theoreticians focusing on the topic of community. The contingency can be understood as follows. Contingency is something that is neither needed nor impossible. So it is as it is, but it could also be something else. The concept itself is not limited to this definition because it describes what can happen, what is possible. Of course, the concept itself has a very long history. The root comes from Old Greek, from Aristotle, ad hominum, the possibility of something happening, the possibility and the contingency is already included in that. And Aristotle said that this was something that was neither impossible nor needed. This probably points to a very specific role of this concept in our situation, because it deals with the very important new approach to this kind of situation and this kind of contingency. Managing the situation, managing the contingency is, of course, influenced by a whole series of issues. And Luhmann described and defined contingency not as a kind of bad spell that needs to be broken or controlled. It's neither a curse. Let me focus on the three characteristics and place them within the context of the COVID-19 pandemics and how these issues are being internalized and how they affect the situation, current situation. It's interesting to see the definition and the theory by Luhmann. He considered it to be something quite characteristic of modern humanity, and any attempts to actually control contingency leads to further contingencies. Once again, we could say that the concept itself is a way to deal with the current situation. However, it's not the complete solution of the problem, but it is a solution based on the fact that contingency as our philosophical sources tell us, is being multiplied, just like Midas gold. So contingency might be the Midas gold of the modernity. It also poses the greatest challenge: how to deal with contingency, how to understand it and approach it in today's world. Contingency seems to be the key word, the key concept of what's happening, especially in the emergency situations. But of course, it also applies to possible situations. It might be legal contingency, political contingency, decisions, or lockdown contingencies, restrictions, the social life contingency, digital life contingency, and contingencies related to all other forms of life. There is also the contingency related to the future, understood as the non-horizon of the future, in terms of lockdown and necessity, obligation to wear masks, face masks, and apply other prevention measures. They are a kind of attempt to control the situation, which is part of the contingency, but there is no one solution, golden solution for the virus that has been applied by all the countries. For me, it's important and significant that the coronavirus crisis has demonstrated even more acutely that in modern societies, the contingencies and its conditions are emphasized, but also it leads us to consider loyalty and openness. The contingency becomes a kind of epistemological paradigm, which is slowly and gradually being perceived as such by the societies. The societies are becoming aware of it. Let me say a few words about the new experience of dealing with contingency, describing it by three characteristics, major characteristics. Perhaps I should mention first the tendency that the contemporary world is becoming more and more important than the future, which means that within the current debate about the pandemic, people tend to stress the present time instead of future. It's a very interesting and important aspect of the approach, people to become aware of the current situation and deal with the present situation, focusing on the ongoing processes. This relates to the virus. We are aware that we do not have full knowledge about it. We don't know enough about the infection trajectory, how the virus is passed on from person to person. It's one of the elements of the contemporary world that only the present is being taken for granted. Raman said that the postmodern discourse is a discourse without future. It lacks future. Future is not being emphasized anymore. It's not being discussed. We are focusing on the present and on ongoing processes. That's why there is a need to document the progress in terms of dealing with the pandemics and to emphasize successes. I think our webinar is part of this. Let me give you another example about what I just said. At the beginning of the pandemic, the head of the World Health Organization in March last year said that we are not on a one-way road. We can actually fight the virus and prevent its attack. That was the statement then, but very shortly he started using new concepts like new normalcy and a statement that we all need to learn how to live with the virus. by our experience, we see what works and what doesn't. And again, the future perspective and the future itself becomes more obscure. We are focusing more on the present. The second characteristic, which is coming more and more to the fore, is the awareness of the power of the realities, different realities, realities that may host something that might happen, the alternative realities. And of course, it's a fertile ground for conspiracy theories. People start to challenge the very idea that the virus is affecting people, that it's related to 5G networks. The conspiracy theories are part of this tendency. But of course, it involves a much more complex process, which also affects the vaccines. Not everybody understands the mechanism, how the vaccines work. There is some confusion there, and from this confusion, we have legal issues coming forth, human rights, etc. We can have moral judgments. That's why individual approach to the pandemics is very important, because national governments are taking decisions which are vital. The questions whether we should introduce lockdown or whether we should back down on the restrictions, there are key issues. The third characteristic, the present contingency and its experience, is pretty special. People become more and more, they accept the contingency more and more at ease with the fact that the world is not going to revert to what it used to be, that there is no going back. We can describe it as the way to project the new world based on the contingency effect, which we also can observe. Luhmann says that the future of the present decisions depends on the present, and that it generates kind of insecurity within societies. The last example, Zaragouri, a Georgian doctor, has described the process of vaccine creation as something that is very similar to the never-ending story of painting the Golden Gate Bridge. There's a myth according to which if the Golden Gate Bridge gets painted in its entirety, a tragedy might occur. But it is a never-ending process. So translating it into the pandemic's language, we know that the situation is not hopeless, but we do not know what's going to happen. Anyway, it's going to take a long time. Even if we do have vaccines, once we have the vaccine, the virus is going to evolve, so we'll need another vaccine. So this is kind of the thinking about the pandemic that we can use. Thank you very much. Thank you. Now I'd like to ask Professor Johannes Weiss to take the floor. I hope that you could hear the interpretation, Professor. I do hope that you can hear me. Yes.
Okay. In gewisser Weise passt das, was ich vortragen will, zu dem letzten Vortrag, den ich leider nur
in a way, what I wish to say actually is very close to my colleague has just said. I was asked to tell you in what way the German citizens are approaching the pandemics, and probably I'm going to repeat things that what the sociologist has discovered. Let me start with the first question. We have observed that Germans are much less religious than we assumed them to be. Jacques Le Goff, a French historian, described the medieval society by saying that people were becoming aware through religion. In the area of spirituality, the medieval mentality can be described as impossible without the use of religious terms. So when we leap to the current situation, the pandemic, so we also encounter some kind of possibility. And we see this in the reactions. It's impossible to express things through global relationships. In the past, when we had cataclysms, natural disasters, pandemics, people had very different connotations. There were very different circumstances. Nobody spoke about closing the churches. Theologians, priests have not been interpreting what was happening, are not interpreting what is happening in religious terms. Rudolf Ischte, a sociologist who theorized systems, wrote an article some time ago, which was published by a newspaper, in which he wrote that what is happening during the pandemic and in the conditions of the pandemic is in contrast with what the systems theoreticians were describing as the functional differentiation. The functional differentiation is being challenged. So religion has, in a way, been left out from the functional differentiation, and science has been entering in the arena of politics. So science and natural sciences, humanities, now have a much bigger impact on the political systems and the legal systems.
Der bei uns auch viel diskutiert wird, neuerdings viel diskutiert wird, als Erfahrung mit dieser Pandemie in Deutschland ist der,
Well, very often in Germany, the discussion is related to the pandemic experience, and it is brought up that the political system in the very beginning was respected, while now this political respect to the system has been breached institutionally, but also individually, personally. I think it has to be said. The question is whether this breach is a fixed one, whether it's going to go on, stay where it is. Well, the result of the pandemic is the following. In the very beginning, Germans were praised for the right approach to the pandemic, great equipment, the right staff. And very little of that is left. Many people came to the conclusion that we in Germany need to realize that the vision of Germany as a country, as a state that can solve all kinds of problems, deal with all problems, has been very much damaged.
Oder die Deutsche Bundesbahn und vieles klappt nicht mehr in Deutschland. Und man sieht in dem
Already before that, we saw all kinds of issues in Germany, all kinds of projects, on all kinds of projects like railway projects, airport projects. During the pandemic, we are seeing that again. That is the manifestation of the same failure. That is, people are disappointed with how Germans behave and how they operate. And the last point I would like to raise is the perspective, the sociological perspective. In the very beginning, sociologists were asked, and I recall that very well. Professor Hose said that the pandemic can be a source of a transformation, a way to rebuild our world. We discussed that no more. Now we are limited to a discussion of the winners and losers of the whole pandemic, taken into account what is going on. That is, inequality, social inequalities that have been magnified during the pandemic. It is my belief that these negative outcomes of the pandemic will be very much expressed in these inequalities, socially speaking, much more so than the positives. So looking at individual regions, the pandemic has laid bare how inefficient, how helpless different political groups and governments have been. It was not so in the beginning. Politicians were very popular and respected, and this has changed, and this is the big change. That's all on my part. Let me cut this short. Thank you very much for your patience. I'm sorry I had all kinds of problems. I'm a total analphabet when it comes to technology. This is an example. Again, in terms of digitization, Germans are far, far behind other countries. I'm an example of a complete lack of digital training. I had to ask for help. Thank you very much for your patience. And also in the beginning, when I cut in, not knowing that my mic was open, and you were hearing my commentaries, I did not want to do that. I'm sorry about that. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, dear professor. Let me draw your attention to something that was raised by Professor Weiss. That is, taken into account the disappearance of religion, it seems that according to him, can you hear me? Okay. Germany is much more secular than was thought. While science has entered the ground of politics outside its realm so far, which is very interesting because it shows that science is overtaking religion, taking religion's place, so to say. And this bears certain consequences. Why? Well, because our approach to science means that we expect modern civilization and science to control all kinds of events. And recent events show that it is not capable of that. While, since we believe that that is the task of science, then we take the responsibility away from particular institutions, science institutions, political institutions. This is very interesting because looking at what really happened, one might say that the whole epidemic is not such a terrible one at all. The death ratio is not a vicious one. Imagine the same one with a death toll standing at 50 to 80% death ratio, like in the case of Ebola. What would be the consequences for our civilization? This shows how unprepared mentally we are for these events mentioned by Ms. Shorishvili, the consequences of realities. The reality is not being controlled at all, although that's what we expected. This dissonance between the reality and our expectations cause a certain damage to the vision of the government, as mentioned by Professor Weiss and Mr. Temlin. What is the result? Asked whether this is going to bring about a certain transformation of the mentality in the Western world. Well, no. I think that instead we are going to have a world where the stronger win. They take advantage of the pandemic. And the question I'd like to ask you now is the following. I already tried to allude. Of course, this was a very helpless wrap-up of what you said in order to ask you the following question and to give you leeway to expand on what you said in the first round. Well, we raised a number of questions indeed, because Ms. Shigorshvili clearly said that this haphazard character of the world, this contingency, laid bare the importance of nation states and a crisis of the supranational institutions, as mentioned by the gentleman. These claim excessive competences, excessive remit that they cannot really exert in practice, being incapable of that. So on the one hand, these supranational institutions like the European Union that tries to regulate everything, the climate, social behaviors, deep meaning, and so on and so on. And it makes us realize how these expectations are damaged in confrontation with the reality. So the legitimacy of these institutions is broken. So does this mean that the prestige of nation states will increase? Well, Professor Weiss said that at the same time we lack trust to these institutions. So this world of insecurity, uncertainty, will it really be transformed? Will the result be what Professor Weiss mentioned, that is, the strengthening of the phenomena that are already in place, that the strong will be even stronger in the social sphere? So now a round of speeches, 5 minutes long each. Thank you very much. Right, let me pick up on two issues. That is, first of all, the access to vaccines and what was said by the Minister of Health for Singapore. He said that nobody is going to be safe until everybody is safe. I think this is a powerful sentence showing that solidarity is the most efficient way, the most efficient strategy to fight off the pandemic. But more importantly, to me at least, is what Professor Weiss said. Namely, I agree with the opinion of one of the four speakers, that is Professor Beriashvili, that is, normalization of a humanitarian disaster is the most dangerous process that we are dealing with currently. The normalization of a humanitarian disaster is the abdication of local and global elites from the issue of the safety of the particular population, the particular community. This is possible, and in certain regions it is actually taking place. In terms of secularization, I am not a great fan of this process. I am of the belief that it is no coincidence that the Vatican has been strongest in its comments against the process of normalization of this humanitarian disaster and this capitulation, political capitulation. I'd say that political realities are more complex, like Mr. Wilczyn said. The remarks by the Vatican are in defense of the European Enlightenment, because the idea behind Enlightenment was solving or rather defending against disasters and not normalization. So this ideological landscape seems to be of a more complex character. Again, this brings me back to the issues between Habermas and Ratzinger 20 years back. Namely, this is another situation, another opportunity that shows that religion might come out as an interesting supporter of the Enlightenment ambitions, that is, fending off disease, among others, which is possible, but this it requires a combination of methods and not being limited to vaccination, but supporting vaccination with other behaviors and supporting discipline related tools alongside social tools like the European 500+, which will allow for the legitimacy for this social pact and the European social and political elites, and limitations to the mobility in Europe, which could be expanded on by referring to various biological arguments. But let me stop at this point.
Dank. Ja, in meinem Kontext würde ich nur hinzufügen, dass mehrere Theoretiker.
Thank you very much. From my point of view, I would like to add that a lot of theorians, Jürgen Habermas, would also say that this situation is a kind of an existential uncertainty in which we find ourselves. In his commentary, he even said that never before was everybody forced to live in this kind of situation, in this kind of conditions, in which our lack of knowledge is so severe and in which one lives under a certain kind of pressure in a very uncertain time, because, well, we have no other possibility. Marcus Gabriel and others also express their views similarly, and they describe the post-pandemic situation as a certain existential uncertainty. Although this situation should not only be seen in terms of uncertainty exclusively, but also in terms of a take on reality and a way to deal with the situation. I think that this situation is going to be a rather particular one. What do I mean by particular? Well, I mean a modern way of thinking, which is not based on ideas based in arguments, or rather, through saying this might be different, the situation might be different, everybody has a right to a different point of view, etc. And religion indeed is a strong resource and might be of high importance, particularly in terms of contingency, because religion gives a certain feeling of purpose, sense, which is another topic for yet another interesting discussion.
Ja, was soll ich sagen? Ich könnte anschließen, das, was Katie gesagt hat, dass Religion wesentlich Kontingenzbewältigung.
Well, what could be added? Let me just say that I agree with my speaker. Indeed, religion might expand our view of contingency. Like it was said, this function of religion is an important one, and religion could not have done anything in this situation of great threat, because fending or resisting, as Max Weber talked about it, about seeing the world through science. Now it seems that also science can be rationalized. And a lot of people are convinced that there is need to rationalize the world, the science. And this is the world that we are headed for. Oh, I forgot what I was going to say. Let me just put a final note to this by saying that the situation is the following. I'm not saying from the point of view of a sociologist, because I have not carried out empirical studies, but on many points, indeed, this uncertainty among Germans is a very big one. And there is one argument I had forgotten, that is about the EU. The EU as a community of nations, through experience and through fending off the pandemic, can it be a winner, or will it be a loser at the end of the day? Will it prevail? Well, the purchase of vaccines was organized through the solidarity-based mechanism. That is, in the name, on behalf of everybody, we purchase the vaccines, and it didn't work out because the European Commission was, the offer was not binding enough for everybody. So the solidarity of European countries came out to be very difficult. It could have worked out, but it did not in this case, because the EU did not play the role, the Commission did not play the role of this glue among nations. This is just an example, but a very important one. Let me be quite frank. I talked to my wife about this, and this was too skeptical for her, too negative, too sober. That's why I said something positive. I wanted to say something positive at the end of that conversation, like you might like me to do, but I have no such positive note to finish off on. I am very sorry that I got a little bit lost in what I was saying. I'm sorry, this had no structure. I simply decided to choose a different program to join this discussion. It knocked me off my track. In any case, thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Professor. I didn't see any chaos in what you said. It seems very well structured, and I think everybody saw it as such.
Let me ask the question. Does the European Union can draw conclusions from these pandemics if we look at the facts? We cannot state any real success. What the fact stems them from? Perhaps from too much ambition. At the same time, the emergencies, the crisis situations really show the functioning of specific institutions. Let me go back to the financial crisis. Financial crisis in 2007, 2008 really demonstrated how the institutions work. The EU institutions got frozen. The strongest countries, which were Germany and France at that time, they kept meeting, inviting Great Britain, United Kingdom, or Italy, and they were taking decisions that the EU institutions later on enforced. And then it turned out that over and above the solidarity, there are the stronger players who, in an emergency situation, do not even pretend to act together. Let me use the example of the vaccine that the professor said. Ursula von der Leyen, the commissioner, the chair of the president of the European Commission, officially stated that there was an agreement, agreement on the purchase of the vaccines, and it's a kind of community law. At the same time, it turned out that Germany has been buying millions, thousands of millions of vaccine doses. In a few days' time, something that was supposed to be European law became, well, kind of a gentleman club agreement, meaning that whoever wished to stick to the agreement sticks to the agreement, but it's not necessary. This actually demonstrates something. Let's imagine it was Poland and not Germany that bought the vaccine. I just cannot imagine what would happen. It shows once again what is actually happening behind the beautiful slogans. It's a game of power, and the European Union is transforming in terms of its center, and the peripheries who are subordinate to the center. I'm not saying that this is only bad will. It actually stems from the ordinary logic of how such institutions function. We can have an opinion, utopian view that our interests are being infringed upon, but the nation states are there, the politicians are being held responsible by the citizens. The politicians act as they do. Generally speaking, they are trying to promote the interests of their nation. And then these the ambitions and aspirations actually lead to the whole structure transforming into something where some enforce their views on others. Mrs. Reuschwili mentioned that religion was actually making things meaningful. Let me relate to that. Religion does make things meaningful, but at the same time, it forces us to come to grips with the great mystery of being. The Enlightenment was trying to imagine very vaguely that the human mind can actually see the reality, and it can design a reality that which there will be no contingency. It turned out to be impossible. We do live in a world which once again shows us very clearly that our representations of reality, when faced with the facts, they crumble. These are our illusions. They turn out to be illusions. The fact that we are controlling nature, that we can ignore the actual state of play, which is the nation states and specific separate countries, and we can actually try to enforce supranational being entities. I think the EU will learn nothing from this. Those who decide the shape of the EU are not going to learn anything. The history has shown that people do not draw conclusions from history, and it's very sad. Let me now give the floor back to Professor Krasnodębski, who will facilitate, who will tell us what will happen next. Thank you very much. Yes, I am present. Very interesting discussion. Thank you very much to our facilitator. I would like to promote a book written by Bronisław Wilstein and published recently. Unfortunately, it's now only available in Polish. The title, the working title, would be The Rebellion and Affirmation, which is a critique of the European philosophy. We'll see. Professor Weiss surprised me a little bit with his pessimism. We know each other from our time in Kassel. He was advising me actually when I was studying there, studying Weber. Please, my best wishes to your wife, by the way. Let us now pass on to the third part of our conference. It is to be led by Professor Andrzej Zybertowicz. I see that he has already joined. Yes, I can hear you, but I cannot see you. You need to click on the camera symbol. Yes. The system tells me to look for a different video source. I'm trying to click on the camera symbol. On the top, there should be a button, stop video, start video, and this should help. Let me try again. But I get the message that I cannot start the video. Well, there might be some technical glitch, but you're using Zoom, right? Yes, when you log on, there are options. So probably you could log off. Yes, we still have some time in line with our schedule. Maybe I can log off. I still have time to log off and log on and see, maybe it will work. All right, so we still have some time. Perhaps any of our participants would like to take the floor. So I open the floor for discussion. There were interesting in references to Weber and other thinkers. A question about progress. I can see that Professor Lohmann is telling me that he wants to take the floor. Yes. Yes, there was a question, and it relates to the last panel. The pandemics is a global challenge, which means that the time where ordinary mechanisms and divisions in our continent, they are no longer valid. We need a new approach to specific problems. And the nature of these problems is such that, that the whole world is facing the same problems. We do not have a solution. The same goes for religion. Religion is not responsible or responsible here, so the religious contingency will not help us regain health. Perhaps religion will help us to deal with consequences and results of the pandemics. It might be helpful, but it's not a solution that we need right now. I also think that the national solutions, nation-based solutions, are not sufficient. Perhaps they can be effective in specific periods and in specific time frames. We can fight pandemics here and now, but if the disease spreads further elsewhere, it will surely come back to us. So now, the EU is saying that we should show solidarity and we should do things differently, to act together, to buy vaccines together. It's a completely different way. If we don't take it, all the rich countries would say, okay, we do have a company which can make the vaccine and we can be secure. But actually, other countries such as Slovakia, Czech Republic, perhaps Poland as well, would not have such an opportunity, would not have the institutional capacity to perform the work on the vaccines, to perform all the required tests, etc., etc. The process requires a lot of investment. These companies were so quick creating vaccines because they invested billions of dollars and of euro. And no other country would be able to do that. If we didn't act together, we would have a much bigger crisis right now. The EU will learn based on this emergency, based on this disaster, and will learn from what didn't work. We cannot say that it's going to just reinforce the national approach. Yes, I think this is a topic that we could discuss for a long time. I think it is justified to say that we need solidarity in such a situation, but the question also is whether we need centralizing as well. Our part of Europe. And in our part of Europe, Europe is thinking about the central planning, because if we plan to have a zero-emission economy by 2050, we need to have a central plan. We need to ask this question over and over again, whether the form has not become dysfunctional. And also that the discussion hides and obfuscates the rivalry and competition. Right now, we're in conflict with China and with Russia. The Northern Balkans and the vaccines that are being offered there. The Commissioner Breton today said that he sees nothing wrong with this, but probably the Russian Sputnik vaccine, which turns out to be quite effective and which has been subject to much ridicule, will be bought, will be purchased. Of course, China also found a way to deal with it. Russia, who faced a lot of ridicule, and which has quite shabby laboratories, was able to produce quite an effective vaccine. Whereas we, the Europeans, well, so the question, there is a question, probably we will not be able to decide what the answer is today. Professor and myself, we do have this critical approach because we see this human aspect. We see how decisions are being taken. The rationality, irrationality of it all, the personal interest involved. I do agree with the hypothesis that we are not talking about going back to Europe as it used to be, with national egoisms being in competition with each other. We always had a kind of community thinking. And I think that our trialogue is also a symptom of this community, form of community. And we have colleagues from Georgia, and we have these different views over the continent. We have people from Germany, one of the countries which is called the hegemons of Europe. We come from the country which is being criticized, but which has been pretty successful within the region. And Georgia, who would wish to join, and we in Poland, we would like to see as part of the EU, but the elites in Germany, in Belgium, France are not so keen on having them. So we tend to be much more willing to show this solidarity. I could actually cite other examples where the calls for solidarity are not being heard. In the past, well, perhaps we could at some point have a discussion, the solidarity. I can see that Professor Zybertowicz has joined us again. Professor Andrzej Zybertowicz is a very renowned Polish sociologist. He used to be a social constructivist, but now, well, he for some time he has been focusing on artificial intelligence. So I pass the floor to him. Thank you very much. Welcome. Let me first introduce the biograms of our panelists. One of the biograms actually inspired my first question. Let me remind you that in this panel we will be discussing whether the pandemic has changed our way of thinking about basic problems faced by philosophy, economy, and politics, and if so, in what way. And that we will have three specialists facing the question. Poland is represented by Dr. Justyna Schulz, who leads a very important think tank, the Western Institute Zachodni, which monitors German politics and co-creates the main directions of the Polish policy. Dr. Schulz studied both in Poland and in Germany. She collaborates with many different foundations. She also taught at the university in Bremen and was one of the advisors to the European Parliament. Georgia is represented by Ms. Mariam Kazatadze from the University of Tbilisi. She translated Hegel's work from German to Georgian. She also translated Kant. She authored 12 articles on the contemporary social theories. And also we have on board Professor Theo Gobusch, a German philosopher and a historian of philosophy, Professor Emeritus Professor Emeritus in Germany, the chairman of the Association of Lectures and Teachers of German Philosophy in the Theological Institute. He worked on Plato, and he became known for his work on Plato outside of his specific fields. That's why I would like our first question to actually relate to the most known metaphor, the metaphor of the Plato's cave. When we look at the societies, politicians and experts who are responsible for dealing with the pandemics, how they drift, how they get confused, how they keep changing their recommendations and then decisions. When we see the experts having doubts whether we should impose further restrictions or actually lift restrictions, we need to say that we are all in the crisis of in a deep crisis of confusion. Historically speaking, from the moment when Plato formulated the principles of art based on the suspicion that we are functioning in a mystified reality, a cave from which we are trying to get out, then we started to try to get away from this cave. I think that it was not the Enlightenment that intensified this process. It came with the internet and with the IT technologies, which actually reversed the relationship between the ruler and the servant that Hegel explored. From the moment we became part of the network, it seems that technologies are ruling over us. In the pandemics, we hear the statement that we would be nowhere if we didn't have these technologies. We wouldn't be able to get in touch with our families. We wouldn't be able to work. We see the confusion. Millions of people are falling prey to conspiracy theories. Experts cannot agree on what kind of strategies of dealing with the pandemics are the best, and politicians whose actions are being legitimized daily by the digital sphere, they're actually changing their decisions continually. So my question is, are we now in the digital Plato's cave that is separating us from reality? Have we, as a civilization, started drifting because we lost touch with the human reality? Dr. Schulz, please.
które jest rzeczywiście bardzo dużym wyzwaniem też. Postaram się odpowiedzieć z punktu widzenia...
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me on this debate and for this question, which is quite challenging. Well, indeed, I can confirm the perception along the lines that we are currently in a state of being lost, a confusion, where the paradigm of dependencies, economic dependencies, is being brought into question due to the crisis phenomena. And in this situation, we were forced to create ad hoc new institutions that would respond to these crisis phenomena without actually having fully worked out a narrative and legitimacy for these institutions. In my opinion, a common denominator combining all these attempts at finding our ways in this new economic reality are tied to this redefinition of the so-called proverbial Homo economicus. And I do not mean questioning the rationality of the Homo economicus by saying that Homo economicus is not fully rational. It is also driven by emotion, because this is a one-way street. Bringing into question the rational character of decisions being made could create a reference point for delegitimizing democratic processes as well. I think that what has changed significantly compared to the situation in the last 30 years, let me refer to this period because my point of view is a Polish one. That is, I'm referring to the period in which Poland started creating an economic system after political transformation. It is all about moving away from a narrative where the individual was ascribed the motive of action, where the society towards a society being the motor. A society used to be a sum of individual activities, and these individual behaviors coordinated by the free market was supposed to create these collective entities, these interdependencies, and regulate all the institutions, including the indirect ones of the whole society. That is, the philosophy was that if every individual takes care of themselves, and then everybody is taken care of enough. In this liberal philosophy, what was not taken into account was a particular and basic role of collectivities. That is, for example, nation states. These regulate this indirect area, the indirect tissue, the intermediary tissue that is also important for the workings of the economic sphere. I would like to refer not to Plato. Instead, I'd like to refer to Hannah Arendt and her Aristotle reference, where she referred to Aristotle and differentiated between different domains of freedom. And I'd say that the freedom of the liberal narrative was only limited to oikos, that is, to this individual taking care of its down-to-earth issues, its everyday issues, while the issues of the agora, that is the political debate, the regulation of the collective domain, was, so to say, delegated to specialists and meritocrats. And I think that the most extreme form of this kind of thinking and organization of the economic life was present in the Middle Eastern countries of Europe, the post-communist countries, where this moving away from politics was very high, and the political domain, at least in the 90s and early 2000s, was mainly limited to implementing the external rules. I'd say that that was the spirit of the time. It is very well analyzed by referring to the monetary union and the crisis of 2008, which demonstrated that the lacks of the monetary union stemmed from the fact that institutions were not catered for that would regulate the bonds, the interdependencies among these institutions, stemming from the fact as such that they created a certain collectivity. That is, the monetary union was also focused on every domain having to be in itself stable. The assumption was that if every single one is stable, there should be no crises. While the 2008 crisis showed that the market cannot self-correct, that is, the market issues were undermined, and also, although all the individual elements of the system functioned well, the whole system of interdependencies and interrelationships caused a banking crisis and a contagion of the risks. And a response to the crisis was additional regulation that regulated this system of interdependencies that is banking union and the additional fund. Quite similarly, Poland or Hungary defined in response the weaknesses and decided to strengthen the collective entity in the form of the state. And this concerns both our region and all other countries that dealt with crises, both back when the monetary union was a current topic and after the strengthening of the union that is currently during the pandemic. Apparently, not only financial markets have been defined as a public area which should be stabilized by the state, but also we have the healthcare system, climate change, climate protection, social protection, and all these areas have been defined due to the crisis as areas where the states should actively support these systems. And the rules of free market have been moved aside, and free competition as such. Preparing to this speech, I prepared the rules that were in operation 20 or 30 years back and compared them to what we currently have in place in terms of policy. These are completely opposite extremes. Let me give you a couple of points. For example, the role of the central bank, the collaboration between the central bank and the Home Revenue Office, the role of debt, the involvement of the state to support the private sector, the state taking care of the labor market. Also, the approach has changed completely to social policy. It is now being seen as supportive and stabilizing towards the economic system and not only a burden to this system. Quite so, 20, 30 years ago, the best industrial policy was believed to be none. Currently, even Deutsche Bahn expects an active industrial policy in areas where risk-taking by private entities would be too high for private entities. The central bank is involved in Greenville policy. Based on the position that the market valuation of risk and price for climate change is not sufficient, saying that this is a tool not effective enough to leave it to the free market. Of course, back in the day, mainly economic factors were discussed. Now we're talking in terms of guaranteeing income to all citizens, and so on. And all these areas, let me just tell you, where the state as a community, an emanation of the community, plays a role and a key role, and the success of the individual depends, among others, on the institutional framework and the collective framework in which it operates. And it has to be a subject of our analysis, because the EU is also this kind of entity, collectivity. I'm now drawing to an end, so let me conclude. I might expand during the questions round. So by wrapping up, let me tell you that what we saw as certain automatic mechanisms in economy have now become politically worked out regulation. Before, we focused mainly on the individual rights, and currently is the collectivity, the group that is a main subject. So we have to think about what kind of regulation is such that is supportive of both. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this presentation. My understanding is that your line of thinking is the following, at least in the area of going outside of the realm of economic arguments. We tend to move out of the doctrine and digital cave, right? Is that what you mean? Well, I would say rather that we have new practices, but we are still lacking certain argumentation for the practice that is in place in reaction to crisis. Right, thank you very much for that. Now, Mariam Kazatadze, please give us your account. Does pandemic mean moving out of the previous realm, these schemes, forms of thinking, and in a cognitive way, are we dealing with the current situation or not? Right, thank you very much for having me on this debate. I would like to focus on social and structural aspects of the crisis, the coronavirus aspects, from a philosophical point of view. The coronavirus crisis has had wide-reaching consequences because it shifted our way of thinking. Also, it made us notice the crisis in every aspect of our daily life. Of course, the outcomes were different depending on the country, depending on the model of the state and different conditions. What I mean is that the outcome of the disease for the institutional structure differs. Mark Gabriel, a well-known German philosopher, said that the coronavirus met social resistance, and the disease might have went a different way without any effects of globalization and on competition in the market. This competition, morally speaking, also is one of the few solutions to this crisis. And most importantly, we finally all realized that without the rule of solidarity and without a certain level of morality, it's going to be difficult to understand the new world. Macro market structures also fell victim to the coronavirus. The death of many was something we had to consider, take into account from the very beginning, but the priorities varied depending on the culture and the individual societies. And the unequal system of sharing the resources had different results, different outcomes. So, understanding these outcomes will be key for understanding the new reality created by coronavirus, which created a new way of understanding of the reality. The privatization of healthcare, but also insurance systems, and also attempts at nationalization of healthcare and the competition, for example, between East and West in terms of sharing of the vaccines, but also attitudes to those who might spread the disease. They have gone to the sideline. The current situation meant that a lot of people had to look again, have a fresh look at their views, and they had to update them. Everybody is trying to level out the results of a liberal economy and to move towards a more balanced approach. Currently, societies are not mainly focused on having profits, but rather on keeping dignity, human dignity, which is a basis for future solutions, and it's necessary for every human being worldwide. It's something that cannot be taken away or given away in return for a better position in the market. The social dimension is, important from the point of view of society, of globalization. Like Kant said in one of his works, breaking the law in a single place of the world is not breaking the law in a different one anymore. History and examples quoted today have their source in Hegel's philosophy. From the sociological approach to perceiving the reality means also that as a result of a world of values, founded in values, certain traits of character are those that move to the forefront. Also, social communication is important, as well as respect towards all citizens in every single country, in order to avoid pathological situations in every society. This is why the institutional role of promoting equality in certain roles is very important. Every nation, every society in which freedoms are limited in an irresponsible way makes those people confused. But sometimes the institutional leeway also is limited, so you have to put together the egocentric needs of the individual with those requirements, so that institutions are not abused. The institutional take on freedoms means that everybody is equal. All citizens of a country are equal from this point of view. From the point of view of atomic models of countries where the model only supports the weakest, and you run the risk that there might be an unfair spread of resources, and that not everybody is treated fairly. Different systems that are uncertain generate this atomic division. The state needs to create such conditions of life that are in line with human dignity. So these are the challenges in terms of equal rights for citizens. In many models of governance in many countries, currently, politically speaking, individuals are not important, which is a challenge. This challenge was particularly visible during this and the previous crisis. From this point of view, this pandemic seems to have a very negative impact on social aspects, which means that it's not only a medical problem, but also a social challenge, particularly and economic ones, especially in the terms of the division of resources, spreading of resources. What do we do with people who have no insurance, for example, and countries where the system of healthcare is falling apart, and there is a lot of such social groups? Well, the privatization of certain systems brought about an increase in divisions in social groups. The rule of acceptance, of respect to every individual has a certain therapeutical importance, because it means equality of every single one towards the right, and it also allows for a diagnosis of social structures and social relations that were not so obvious before the crisis, not only nationally, but also internationally. In terms of moral issues of politics and solidarity among people, this is a very important point which might drastically limit the terrible results of this crisis and might bring about a new order, which means that, you know, a new policy based on equality of all social groups is very important and necessary, which is, by the way, it's no luxury. Like Marcus Gabriel said, this is the only way to create a future, a political point of view based in social respect and acceptance of the other is based in the acceptance instead of competition, and this is why this is so important in social theory, bringing about a real equality which is based in this mutual recognition. Based on our current situation, this could be adapted to the current framework. In every situation, there is an opportunity for a better solution and improving the situation also in the crisis brought about by COVID-19. This is why so often the question is brought concerning what decisions should be made in order for people to be seen as equals and how rules should be changed in order for people to be the main point, starting point for politicians and for politics, for policies, so that ethics is binding and absolutely obvious for everybody. And let me stop at this point. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I am wondering whether we are not in a stage in which recognition equals one Dutch politician said, we are all indifferent towards what happens. So the question is whether recognition equals indifference. So moving to cognition, I would like to ask Professor Kolbusz, picking up on what Mariam said, are we not in a stage of such huge claims on the part of the individual, on the rights of the individual, that it makes it difficult to move out of the digital cave of illusion? Professor?
Proszę włączyć, Sie müssen Mikro einschalten, da oben. Wenn man drückt oben auf die Oberfläche oder man geht mit Maus, dann ist es... ja.
Aha, Entschuldigung, ja. Herr Vorsitzender, meine Damen und Herren, warum ist die gegenwärtige Pandemie...
Ladies and gentlemen, Why is this pandemic also a subject for a philosophical discussion? Well, because the pandemic is about death, and death has always been a privileged topic for philosophy. Plato was the first to realize this, make us realize this, and he talked about philosophy as medicatio mortis, that is an exercise in death. Plato means exercising letting go. That is when humans tied to the world through their inclinations, and they are at risk of getting lost in this world. It could get lost in this world. So this exercise and letting go is such an exercise in philosophy is a way to get around this risk and help humans pick up, get things together, and do this, carry out this exercise. So exercising death is focusing on oneself, like philosophy in normal times, regular times, in which one might forget about philosophy, is all about memento mori, reminding about death. Yet during the pandemic, its task is to point to the results of the results of death. Well, death is omnipresent. It is identifiable around us in the mode of fear, and this thought is on the forefront of our awareness. Humans have always been afraid of death, and some philosophers saw that as their main task, to take that fear away. But that fear was rather an abstract one. Currently, during the pandemic, it's a real, specific, concrete one, because death is there around us, everywhere, at any minute. People around the world feel a very specific, concrete fear of death, and this makes them react in a certain way and make moves. The German word Angst, fear, gives us the first pointer from an etymological point of view. It comes from angustia, that is a narrow place, a bottleneck. Augustine saw this and said that who is afraid sees their heart narrowed, shrunk. So the opposite of that to Augustine is love. A fearful person makes their life narrow, lock up, and isolate, makes them isolated from others, alienated. And that's something we see around the world. According to this logic of fear, we close borders, we keep a distance from others, we lock up in our homes. We lock up in ourselves, we make a step back. We see our family as potential source of death. We back out from the public sphere to the private sphere. What is seen by some philosophers as the truth of our life, that is a reflection on oneself, the focus, concentration on oneself, becoming focused, that is being current, making a step back. Currently, during the pandemic, as this becomes a fear, an alienation, a difficulty, a lack, what is private may become unbearable. In this situation, we realize what we have lost. We feel a lack. We realize that life is not orderly. although we feel like we are at home in our four walls within our apartment, but there's this thing that is missing, this shortage. Why are we not enough to ourselves? And Augustine says this, that what is missing in this shrunken, this narrowed situation is width, expansion, and what makes heart expand is love. Love has an ecstatic element about it. Man goes outside its limits, the limits of his own self, towards the other. So this is interpreted in a very wide, large sense. We are looking for another, the other person, the other individual, but also the family as a person, a persona moralis, is also looking for another family, a second family. We keep looking for an exchange with others. What is private is looking for what is public. The state is looking for an exchange with different countries in certain areas or areas of activity. This exchange, this width, expansion, this ecstasy leads to a situation in which, if there are borders, these disciplines break down. And this is true particularly about trade, which has recently become particularly global, but it already was global before that. So even before religion, philosophy, science, before art, it was the primordial element. Even the last elements are not possible without a global network. So I'd say that it's worth defining individual borders, but the individual would get lost if they were forced to lead a isolated life within these defined borders. So our life is bound to a fear of being forced into a narrow limit to what is private, although we are really seeking what is global, worldly. And this also considers the university, the academia, since the sophists came up with the claim, the postulate for institutional education, the element of the public sphere has become a part of learning, of teaching, since in 1200s. This became a fact because teachers, professors of cathedral schools in Paris associated to create a legal entity with its own rights and statutes granted by the king and the poet. And since a university has become a public place of teaching with public lectures, there are public debates.
The pandemic has completely changed the university life,
that short by
stripping
taking
it
that
of its public character.
public element away from the academia.
What we are left with
limited to
are
digital lectures
and
quasi-private
semi-private
conferences via
conferences
Zoom.
led by Zoom. There is no doubt that the pandemics have promoted digitization. The university professors and students whose work is public speeches and participation has been pushed to the private sphere. Both students and professors experience just half the truth, because the full truth is the full encounter and an exchange of thoughts in which both parties can follow the gestures and the mimicry of the interlocutor. The students claim that even though they receive a lot of input, they can only have some responses. There is a lot of subjective approach. Through restrictions in teaching, we came back through time to the moment where the student is actually sitting at the feet of their teacher and just noting down. The same goes on during conferences on Zoom. We have the impression that our colleagues from the United States or somewhere else, they just around the table with us. But it's impossible for us to meet the other scholars in this way. Lectures and discussions become abstract. And what's also significant, usually you have to go to a conference, enter, to follow an arduous journey in order to know the truth. You don't have to do any of this if you participate in digital conferences. This actually strips the academic life of its riches. Well, we can answer the question saying that, yes, the pandemic has changed the way we think. But a further question is whether this change is going to be permanent. What would our thinking look like after the pandemic? Will we once again organize conferences with participants, live participants? Are the institutions going to fund such conferences? Or perhaps they would argue that the pandemic has shown that we can have digital meetings. Why have scientific meetings that require a lot of time and money? In terms of university teaching, I think the further understanding that the direct contact during teaching is indispensable. Once again, we face further questions. Are we going to go back to real shops after the pandemics, since online shopping is so convenient? Are we going to express closeness that we feel towards each other again, as we used to do before the pandemics? Or another question, are we going to shake hands again? Are we going to hug again? So these are the questions that I would like to ask. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much to Professor Leon Kobusz. I think these three voices actually demonstrate that the pandemic has not stripped us of our soul, because all the panelists seem to express their souls, not necessarily answering my specific questions. Let me now try to formulate a simpler question, a more down-to-earth question, and I'll ask you to answer. I will now give just 3 minutes to Professor Kobusz, because he used up his time already. So the question is, while we reflect on the conclusions that have been drawn from the financial crisis in 2007-2008, people say that very few such conclusions have been drawn and that they did not effect any further serious institutional changes. The question is, do you think this will happen again after the pandemics? Will it be the case that our conclusions will be shallow, both in terms of institutional dimension and in terms of our intellectual approach? So I'll give the floor to Dr. Schulz first. Well, of course, it is a question about the future. I wouldn't completely agree that what happened after 2008, which was the crisis of the Eurozone, that it resulted in a shallow reflection. Well, the reflection was shallow because this is a very difficult area where we have to answer questions. How much sovereignty should the nation states have? member states have, and how much of the decision-making process should be transferred to the community level. And we are actually facing the same task right now. There's no single answer to that question. Different parties are having different opinions, and right now we are actually struggling and considering how best to organize these codependencies and introduce institutional solutions to prevent such crises in the future. I think there's a whole series. There's been a whole series of actions and measures on the institutional level that has changed considerably the functioning of both the member states and the whole European Union. The results have perhaps not been subject to enough reflection. For example, there's this Sure initiative mobilizing funds for the emergency measures for businesses. There's another fund, reconstruction fund, which is to finance specific areas, specific technologies, which the EU considers need further push. So institutional changes that have been introduced are, I think, strong enough to have an impact on the process of further development of EU member states' economies and institutions. The mutual influence of fiscal spending and the economic policy is also redefined right now. We are dealing with huge changes. The member states are changing their debt levels, public debt levels. There is no solution yet on who is going to pay for these changes and who is going to bear the costs of recovery. So there's a lot of question marks, but I wouldn't say that it's the result of bad will not to have an answer to these questions, but we are just not entirely sure in which direction we should move the narrative that used to be dominant and which has so far pointed towards privatization and market mechanisms, leaving the decisions on the individual level without taking into consideration community related issues and how they influence the economic sphere. The crises that we faced showed that the economic system cannot work in this way. But the question how to optimize the collaboration, how to organize it within such a complex structure as the EU, where we have states having different potentials and where we still wish to keep a free market and free market exchange, where all the economic actors are playing on a level field. Answering these questions, and this actually is the work that will extend over many years. I'm not sure whether I managed to answer now. Well, you did answer. I see a lot of optimism in your expression, in your intervention. It's almost as if you wish to overlook the benefits drawn from the pandemics by certain pressure groups. Now I would like to ask Mariam Kasatadze to present her point of view on the situation. Will the changes be shallow or deep, both in our thinking and in the institutional solutions?
Danke für die interessante Frage.
Thank you very much for this very interesting question. Well, from the point of view of morality and philosophy, I cannot offer any specific answer as to what the future will bring, what the EU is going to do or what it should do to mitigate the present crisis. And to reduce the impact of its results. From the economic point of view, I think the only way forward is to consider the results of the coronavirus crisis. Because of the polluted water, polluted air, and climate change and their impact, we have a lot of people losing their life. So that's the problems that we are facing on top of the coronavirus crisis, and the pandemics have only just made them more acute. We cannot analyze these problems and if we cannot rely on the principle of solidarity. This, in turn, means that we have not drawn conclusions, we have not done our homework, and the future will be bleak. Coronavirus is not a problem in itself. It's not a problem that can be solved individually by the countries. It's actually a global problem facing global society, and we should face it with solidarity. Thank you. So let me ask for the answer, Professor Teokobusz, about these changes. He already mentioned, but I would like to ask about his philosophical intuition. Will these changes be shallow or deep?
Über die möglichen Konsequenzen sich zu äußern ist
Well, in terms of possible consequences, I need to add that it's quite dangerous to mention this, and I'm quite ambivalent about this. I do have some reflections, which I has already presented as to the approach that we manifest right now towards the situation, towards other people. And the question is whether this will become permanent. If so, it's going to be negative, especially if we cannot find our way back to our pattern of behavior that we could see before the crisis started. On the other hand, we can perhaps trust that what has become visible in this positive way during the crisis. My interlocutors mentioned solidarity and also intergenerational solidarity, where younger people are showing solidarity towards the older people and vice versa. It all actually emphasizes the solidarity, its very nature, and it means that we can actually move forward from this crisis and be morally reinforced. But the question whether the crisis will lead to any further changes
Menschenrechte, die heute angesprochen haben, ausmacht, das weiß ich nicht. Denn ich glaube nicht, dass die Theorie gewissermaßen gefüttert wird von solchen Erfahrungen, sondern da spielt anderes eine Rolle. Aber diese praktischen Konsequenzen, die ich angedeutet habe, die sind durchaus in beiderlei Richtung möglich. Und wenn sie so kommen, dann sind sie auch tief und nicht oberflächlich.
Bardzo dziękuję. Zastanawiam się, kończąc.
Thank you very much for this intervention. In conclusion to this panel session, and perhaps in relation to the panel by Bronisław Wilczstein, can we perhaps say that the humanity is going to leave the trap of the virus only through international collaboration, not only the European collaboration, but international collaboration. And only with such collaboration we can face this virus and other viruses, possibly in the future. But right now we are experiencing the wave of nationalism, and the countries who are trying to teach, for example, Poland, how to think post-nationalist thoughts seem to also be the leaders of this nationalistic behavior in terms of vaccine purchases. I'm not sure whether we can fully trust the Dutch or the Germany on Germany to teach us these lessons. Thank you very much to our panelists, Dr. Justyna Schulz, Marian Kazanadze, and Professor Theo Kobusz for joining this panel, and I give back the floor to our chair. Thank you very much, Professor. We still have some time for questions. Dr. Schulz is going to facilitate this part, the Q&A part of our conference. But since I do have the floor right now, let me ask, or actually mention two things that came to my mind. Professor Kobusz was right in saying that we suddenly remembered death. Every day we see and follow the statistics of people who have died. So it actually leads to a question, how is this pandemic different from other pandemics? If you remember what Camus wrote about the plague, we have a famous Jesuit also dealing with the pandemic. Perhaps now the clergy is not telling us that the current pandemic is actually a kind of punishment. Professor Kobusz mentioned that actually for us right now the source of danger comes from another person, not through their behavior but through their presence, by just an embrace, by a kiss, by singing together. We are being endangered, and because of that we are perceiving other people in a completely different way. When we look at pictures from the past few years, we are even shocked that people used to stand so close together. So perhaps the changes that are occurring will become more permanent. Perhaps one of the impact would be something that people also experienced after World War II. We had existentialism springing up with Sartre writing that hell is other people, death is other people, all the others are a mortal danger, so we should keep distance towards others. And the digital reality is actually protecting us. Meeting through Zoom via computer is making us more safe. Another reflection is that we are now living in times very reminiscent of prohibition in the US, the rave party in Berlin, and around Europe, in Poland, in one of the mountain resorts, there seems to be this kind of rebellion, and partying underground, which also showed that entertainment for modern human beings, for corporate people, let me be blunt, so for people working in corporations, what we consider to be in entertainment, going to the gym, going to the party, having tattoos made, is something that provides meaning in life, which is also leading to a further crisis. So this is one question about the changes. The pandemics, for sure, or actually the death, has reminded us about itself in a very specific way, in this rationalized civilization where there is very little impact from the religion. Even in Poland, another that I would like to mention, and talking specifically to our colleagues from Georgia, in the past I committed a book about the fall of the concept of progress. I do think that history perhaps goes in a specific direction, but for me it was always very difficult, very dangerous to think about politics in terms of hyper-morality. I think the connection between politics and morality is much more complex and it cannot be direct. Professor Weiss mentioned Max Weber, and as we know, Max Weber thought politics is diabolical, that it's about a covenant that relates to power. It's a pact for power. We are not judging the world order, neither in the past nor in the present, nor in the future. Let me also add that Hannah Arendt, whose position was completely different in terms of politics than Max Weber, she thought that politics is actually a sphere where we are not dealing with truths, but opinions. We are not dealing with moral truths that cannot be invalidated, but just like here, we don't know what's going to happen. Political decisions are being made in the situation where we lack knowledge. Like Arendt has said, we should refer to Kant, but not to the critique of the rational mind, but to the ways of exercising power. And all references to morality always end in a way that communism ended. If we had rules, unchangeable rules, what Professor Logutko mentioned, and Professor Lohmann did not agree, but it is actually something that we are facing every day. We are dealing with fanatics, and you cannot talk to such people because they believe in absolute truths, which is based on their moral convictions expressed in the language of human rights. You cannot talk to such people because they can only eliminate everybody with together with Gettina Schmaltz, with Monika Maron, all of us, all of our country become excluded. We are no longer partners for conversation. We are getting labeled. Very serious and more morally difficult issue of abortion. This is just one example. And in my opinion, this stems not from cynicism, but from hypermorality. And religion, I think one of the panelists used this word very rightly, something that is not non-negotiable conviction, which in the political sphere need to be exclusionary. All right, so this will be my reflections. Then I'll pass the floor to Justyna Schulz.
Tak się właśnie zastanawiałam, ale może dlatego, że to było bardzo dużo zagadnień, to może najpierw pozwolimy
Right, I've been wondering. This was very interesting, so maybe we can first answer these questions and then hand over to Mr. Wittstein and Temkin. First, Professor Kombusz. because this is a question directly addressed to him. And to, I don't know who that was who talked about, because Mr. Kobush referred to Georgian participants. Mr. Lohman, Professor Lohman is raising a hand. So yes, okay. And after that, Mr. Wildstein and Mr. Temkin. If you want to take the floor, then you can raise a hand. There's the raise a hand sign icon, and or just send a message. There you go. So I hand over to Professor Kobush.
Ja, ich bin ganz einverstanden mit dem, was Professor Krasnodębski gesagt hat im ersten Teil über die Relevanz der Philosophie.
I fully agree with Professor Krasnodębski. In terms of philosophy in Poland, I cannot refer because I have not been following closely enough. I have not been following the discussion close enough. In terms of the importance and presence of death, it can only be stressed and said that indeed it is so, and raise the issue, because you might have the impression in modern philosophy that this whole thought about death and the notion of death as such is rather far away. It's an abstract thought. And I think it's worthwhile, particularly in this time, using what Plato said to realize that death is a fact, and think about what relates with death, what relates to death. Also, it would be worth looking into the finite character of human life, realize that it's not infinite, and how that translates into political visions. Thank you, that's all. Professor Lohman.
Nur ganz kurz. Wir sollten die einzelnen Bereiche, also Politik, auch
Let me be brief. Politics, religion, and maybe science as well, these disciplines should be seen in a more sober way. They should not be mystified, because we have a solution we fought for, and that result, the result of that fight is the democratic state. And with certain solutions, there's economy with the free market, or science, or science are not under very precise rules. While it seems that certain national stories have been presented on on the forefront, so the certain notions are seen from a different point of view. But legally organized Europe allows for solutions being imperfect, but all solutions can be solved in a reasonable way. For me, politics is not a game of idiots, of individuals who want to realize their own needs, ambitions, and goals. Of course, there are such cases, but they are legally dealt with. It's not that any solution is given forever. We need to react in real time. That was the case in the case of the Corona crisis, which laid bare our weaknesses and the weakness of our law, which does not mean that we have to completely transform our entire system. We need to improve what we have in place. Would somebody like to refer to morality and politics? Would any of the Georgian participants would like to refer to that? If not, then I will give the floor to Mr. Wilstein and then Mr. Temkin so they can respond. I do not want to ask a question. I want to comment. Let me start with what Professor Zybertowicz said at the end. He said that reality shows that crises like the corona crisis make it difficult to deal with individually as a nation state. We need solidarity, and at the same time, this solidarity is difficult to work out. I say that Professor Zybertowicz surprised me with this very modern mentality, saying that we cannot deal with is already a misunderstanding. We cannot cope. We are incapable, because this stems from the way of thinking along the lines. We can deal with anything if we apply the right features and traits of character, which we might not have because there are certain misunderstandings, immaturities, like you sometimes tend to say. And there are certain experiences, limitations, but if we could get over them, then we can deal with anything. And yet, I don't agree, we cannot deal with anything, everything, no, because we need deeper reflection on our human condition. And this is something that should prove this. This is a huge illusion. And this tip-off from nature with this weak virus is something that should make us more cautious, but it's not proven efficient, actually. Quite the contrary, because this virus, at some point, it will die out like every single virus and like every single pandemic in the history of humanity so far. Maybe it's an exception, but it doesn't seem to be one. There might be new viruses, this might mutate and cause new illnesses, etc. When we get over these that we have in place, we learn to cure them, there will be new ones. This does not bring about a fatalist surrender. Absolutely not. This means that we need the awareness that we cannot cope with absolutely anything. Our cognitive capacities are limited, and we need to be aware of that. And this leads me to the following conclusion. Let me refer to Polish experience, my peers who have lived through communism and remember it very well. The basic slogan of communism, called socialism, does not work because there is too little of it, and because people have not grown up enough to appreciate it, but they can grow up. If the elites put the screw on tighter, then they might get educated enough, and the societies, the nation might grow up to appreciate socialism, and socialism will become finally real. And to all the problems brought about by socialism, the solution was more socialism. For all Europe's weaknesses, the solution is more Europe. So what does this experience prove? Well, the experience of the European Union compared to coronavirus is a disaster. So the solution, more European Union. So I'm thinking, maybe we should, maybe this is just a rhetoric question. Maybe what we have is wrong. Maybe the imposition of a certain order of things might be wrong. The founding fathers created the EU as a compact of countries operating for the benefit of the common good. Can you hear me? Okay. So in order to organically overpass barriers and collaborate. And currently what is being done is designing things top down through Maastricht and other treaties, and the result is not the result is not overcoming weaknesses. It is stronger countries imposing solutions on weaker ones. Like in the case of the vaccines, no, it was not the working of the European Union. It could have been, but the situation is as it is. We need solidarity. I do agree with that, but that solidarity can be achieved through cooperation, collaboration among states instead of building a supranational structure, becoming a tool being put to use by the stronger countries. Answering Professor Zybertowicz, what are we going to see? Well, we're going to see more of what we saw, but stronger and to a larger extent, like in the case of the EU, which does not care about what is going on. It keeps implementing its projects without taking into consideration the changed circumstances. Professor Zybertowicz mentioned political decisions. There are such decisions taken by states in an extreme situation, an extraordinary situation, which are then looked into by law. That is, judges in court decide based on what rule, with what knowledge, based on what knowledge these judges can know which decision to make. This is a mythical vision of creating a legal order that deals with all our problems. And the judges are there in the middle of this system, and this is a fundamental misunderstanding that we control perfectly our reality. This is a misunderstanding because at this point, what we call the law, that is the rule of judges rather, not the law, it invades politics, it takes the place of politics. It's not about dropping morality, it's about referring to reality, instead saying everybody needs solidarity, so let's impose solidarity top down through institutions that will impose it. In the first place, we need to see reality as it is, recognize its form, and have the awareness of the fact that we cannot overcome all threats, all conditionalities of humanity. Thank you very much. Let me stop at this point and hand over. Thank you very much. We have to stick to our time schedule, especially since we have more remarks. So let me now hand over to Mr. Temkin. And Professor Lohmann, did you also raise your hand? No, Mr. Temkin.
Thank you very much. Well, I didn't want to enter into a polemic, but I cannot avoid it. Because actually, for me, when we think about pandemics, we need to consider as significant the Roman Catholic perspective. I think I'm one of the most religiously inclined voices. No, you're quite wrong, I assure you. You're quite wrong. You're not the only one, and you're not the most religious participant. Well, I do understand, but I also remember part of the scripture which says that God did not create death, and I think it's worth remembering this part, especially in the context of coronavirus crisis, which means that we should not get used to life and thinking with coronavirus. We should not experiment with our agreement with death, with agreeing the constant risk run by part of our population, or rather that we should coordinate our efforts and minimize the risks of the pandemics as we did with Ebola. And I think it's possible. And Lancet and renowned epidemiologists have said it's possible. And I also think that such a narrative that we should come to grips with our own mortality, that we should not be very ambitious and limit our ambitions in fighting the pandemics, actually could lead to a very potentially disturbing, damaging social perspective. The pandemics is damaging our societies, the universities, education, family life. It undermines the religious life. I cannot imagine maintaining this situation, and I think that all people who consider themselves conservative can also see it, and it can be a position that they share. So apologies for this polemical intervention, but I think that the intervention of Professor Zybertowicz, combining the moral perspective and real politics perspective, is actually the one that could be defended. It's worthwhile to combine these two perspectives. And let me also relate to what Professor Krasnodębski said before. Krasnodębski said before, sorry, which the party underground that you mentioned, its manifestations are really scary. And a lot of attitudes that are now manifesting themselves among different age groups hint at a dire situation, dire social situation. It not only concerns Poland, but other countries and other societies as well. I would like to point out that in many European countries, the authorities reduced the opportunity to spend time and engage in cultural consumption, while the production is subject to restrictions. As a result, in some French regions, for example, we have a very strange situations where we have weekend lockdowns imposed by the authorities who want to prove that they're strict. But actually, they do not enforce specific regulations that would protect workers from getting infected at in the workplace. And there seems to be quite a big disproportionate approach to many measures in many countries, measures related to restaurants, etc., etc., and other industries. And I think it's something we would call the hardcore production sphere, which is also part of the reason why we're going to be kept and trapped within the cycle of further restrictions and lockdowns. The situation is unbearable, and it might actually lead to the situation where the virus gets ahead of the vaccine, which would be a real disaster. The point of view of the world and world politics. It's something that we've been observing partly. For example, in Brazil, let me just finish this one sentence. And it actually happens when the virus is led to experiment in too many bodies and it gets out of control. Let me just add one sentence. I've never, ever said that we should not fight the virus. Actually, drawing the conclusion that we should not fight the virus just because I said that we should face our own mortality is irresponsible. All right, we understand. I noticed that Professor Weiss take the floor. Yes, I would like to say something very briefly. I have one brief question, if I may. We kept on mentioning those who win and those who lose, and I don't understand it entirely. What does it mean to be a winner or to be a loser? Who's going to be the winner? Is it going to be a financial winner? Is it going to be a moral winner? Are we talking about big corporations like the Zoom platform provider or Google? They do have much greater financial leverage. We may have political winners and losers, China, United States. So, in my opinion, we should not actually approach it in this way. We cannot speak of moral winners and losers, because morally speaking, who's going to win or lose? We follow universal values which are going to survive. So what does it mean? Are Europeans much better than Islam followers? Are Europeans better than Brazilians? What does it mean? Well, I do not understand that. I do agree with what Marcus Gabriel said, that we live in a globalized world and that we're going to live in such a world in the future. So it's not going to be the world of globalized economy or globalized morality, but it's going to be a globalized humanist world. That's why I drew on Hegel, because what we need to do is to become aware of the equality of communities of people. All are equal. They have equal rights. We need to consider all individuals equal. Otherwise, we're not going to face future problems. Thank you very much. Thank you for this intervention. I think Professor Weiss wanted to take the floor.
Dass ich Ihnen sehr herzlich danke für diese Möglichkeit, mit Ihnen zu diskutieren. Auf diese Weise sehr anspruchsvoll, technisch.
Well, first, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to participate in this discussion. It was quite a challenge for me from the technical point of view. I'm sorry that I couldn't listen to the interpretation at first, but fortunately I was helped by my son. So one remark from me, I think Mr. Lohmann has already said that we see now that we are dependent on science, not our, but generally speaking, we're dependent on mathematics, medicine, and natural sciences. It's also a warning. We are dependent on these sciences, but also the crisis has demonstrated that there is a spell that we put on them, and we actually can now see the limits as well as opportunities they create, and we should not get trapped in the sciences, advanced sciences. At the universities, the mathematics departments became nothing else than a way to control others, and this control is being exercised by elderly men. In some ways, in some places, mathematics is used for this purpose. I would just only like to add that this meeting was very positive for me. We see that very clearly now what we are missing when we cannot meet in person. I personally cannot wait to meet again, even if it's going to be a digital meeting, and I really hope that very soon we'll be able to meet in person. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this intervention. If I may say something myself, what Professor Zybertowicz mentioned, that I'm probably expressing too much optimism and I'm being unrealistic in my overview of the situation. But I think what we can say, point of view of economics, I think other speakers also stressed that the rediscovery of community or society and the meaning it has, the role it plays in the life of individuals. Professor Kobusz mentioned some pathological elements, but also demonstrated that while we are being trapped in our apartment, we start to feel very acutely that we lack and we miss personal contact, exchanges, and the same goes for economics. It turned out that individuals and individual businesses cannot function well if they are not supported by the community, be it the state, be it the European Union, or any other kind of community that we create and have created. So from the point of view of economics, we are now facing the task of rethinking these connections. What is the best modus operandi for such connections? It's also a big challenge that we're going to face in the future within the EU. So thank you very much, and I would like to pass the floor to the organizers, Professor Krasnodębski. Thank you very much. I would like to thank heartily to all the participants of this conference. I think it was a very interesting, inspiring meeting. We could see also very interesting differences. Most of the German participants stressed the rule of law, the rules, the democratic principles, whereas our guests from Georgia spoke a lot about the morality, universal morality, globalization as the process that is inscribed within democracy. The Polish participants, well, sometimes the views they expressed sounded realistic, sometimes they were pessimistic. We seemed to talk a bit more and focus more on specific processes, but also on the competition and rivalry. Perhaps Professor Weiss decided to actually go into the Polish side or address the Polish side because of the pessimism. Well, it was not on purpose. Anyway, I think it was very interesting discussion. In a very fruitful meeting, which definitely shows that we need a definition of very basic concepts such as progress deaf religion, what we understand as religion. We also heard that it might be a way to overcome contingency. Well, perhaps it is, or perhaps it's not. Death is always our own death, and religion is also related to that, and we need to approach it accordingly. Data might be contingent, but the facts are not. And I have noted down a series of other issues related to solidarity and the approach based on solidarity, human-to-human relationships. I think that, and I hope that we will be able to have another meeting, perhaps in person, together with Dr. Schultz. We came up with an idea for a place, a venue where we could meet close to Poznań in Poland. And perhaps we could also pay a visit to one of the interesting historical sites nearby to have a kind of summer school there. If there is will and wish, I think in the future it would be useful to meet in this way, even during the pandemics. This would probably be a short video conference, but perhaps just changing the environment a little bit, changing the venue would bring us good. I think we need new philosophy, new discourses, and new reflections on the concepts that are being used in politics. And they are used as if they were obvious. They are taken for granted, but they're actually not to be taken for granted, because they have many different interpretations. And I have to admit that sometimes when I meet my colleague, Professor Legutko, in European Parliament, and when I meet other colleagues, Professor Balani, it's as in when we enter into politics, quite a burden for us, because we know that the words and concepts are ambiguous. They allow for many different interpretations. We can compare theories, politicians from the green, the groups of European Greens, sometimes remind me of my colleagues during my student years, the colleagues who knew everything even before they went to the lecture halls.
To zadanie rozmowy i tłumaczenia też trochę, jak my w Polsce myślimy o świecie, o polityce w tych trudnych czasach, że to zadanie nam udało się.
During these difficult times, right now, I hope that we are very lucky to be able to address these topics. Professor Weiss, did you want to say something else? I just wanted to say goodbye.
Yes, I
wanted to say goodbye to my Polish colleagues, my Georgian colleagues. Unfortunately, we cannot meet in person, but hopefully we'll meet very soon. Drinking very good Georgian wine. I think it's a great idea. I don't know of any. I don't know what the great Georgian wines are, but for sure our colleagues from Georgia would help us in this. Yes, exactly. I was once invited to a Skype dinner, but of course, it was not as delicious as usually. Yes, right now we eat dinner in front of our screens. A completely different experience from having a dinner and listening to beautiful music. Yes, of course. Yes, one of our participants said that his grandfather was from Georgia. Thank you to Helena Vanat for organizing this conference. I know that she also has some Georgian roots. There are a lot of Poles who actually
Auf Wiedersehen.
have either roots or close relationships with Georgians. Thank you very much, and see you very soon at a different meeting. Let's be healthy and stay healthy. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Krasnodębski. Thank you to my colleagues. Goodbye.